What is it you want, Barry? What do you want? You want the moon? Just say the word and I'll throw a lasso around it and pull it down.
Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, dying times here.
Come with me if you want to live.
That's it, man. Game over, man. Game over.
The Force will be with you, always.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to 20th Century Geek. I'm your regular host, Scott Weatherly, and I'm joined today by the king of comics in motion, the movie review of himself, Dave Horrocks. Dave, how are you doing? You okay, mate?
I'm very good, Scott. Thank you, and thanks for having us on. I'm trying to think now, is this... I was going to say, is this my debut on 20th Century Geek? But we did the Star Wars crossover, didn't we?
Yeah, when we did the big crossover thing. Have you not done? Have you not done Desert Island Comics yet?
I did that as well. Yeah. So X-Men big issue, didn't you, as well? That's right. That's right. So my memory is just shit, which comes with getting old, obviously. So it's actually concluding a trilogy, isn't it?
You're now doing now you're doing a retrospective.
Yeah.
And we are doing a retrospective. Doing this is one that I put out there. People voted on. There was I put it was quite disparate, to be perfectly honest. The choices I put the Shaft trilogy, which you probably would have gone included Samuel L. Jackson, but Reanimator and Mad Max, and it became a bit of a sort of a head-to-head between Mad Max and Reanimator, but Reanimator won out. And to make it even, we're going to cover 4 films. There's 3 in the trilogy, and then there's From Beyond. So there's Reanimator, Bride of Reanimator, Beyond Reanimator, and then From Beyond. Now we're going to include From Beyond because it's included as a Lovecraft story. And it was also directed by Stuart Gordon and stars Jeffrey Combs. So seems like a sort of like an adjunct kind of sort of film to do. So but before we get into the film, on this episode, we're going to cover Reanimator and Bride of Reanimator. Just sort of split it up. But before we get into all that, we talked about this briefly on the Discord. What's your sort of history then with the Reanimator franchise? Do you have a history with the Reanimator franchise, or is this sort of like new territory for you?
So the first one, I do remember. Now, I don't know if you had this down your way, but I remember we used to have a guy who's a bit like the pop man who used to come around with pop on his van and sell you that, or soda if you're listening from America. And this guy, I mean, in my memory, in my mind, he's basically Arthur Daly. Got the old, brown, long coat kind of thing, old guy with a bunch of videos in his boot. And I remember, I'd go out with my dad and see if we could pick out a video. And this guy had the most shit, like of anything. There was nothing there that you would see in a video shop. I just remember, like, I'd never recognized anything, but I'm sure we got it from this guy and that first Reanimator. Now, this must have been 87, 88 or something like that. So, after it had come out. Now, when I think of it now, I think, well, actually, he must have just got the really shit movies or the B movies, if you like, there was no Back to the Futures there. There was nothing like that, no Terminator even. And so I just remember my dad getting it out. Now, I was too young to watch it at the time. But, of course, being a Generation X kid, that meant I was left alone at home a lot of the time. So, you just search out the videos. Yeah, exactly. You just pop it on. Now, I've never been a massive horror fan. And again, being of that generation, you watch a lot of horror that you're not supposed to. Friday the 13th scared the living crap out of me. Things like Hellraiser, watched it when it first came out on video, and it's like, fucking hell, it is a big leap. And so, I never fancied the horror from there. But this felt like more of a gateway drug. It felt like something I could handle. I just remember the gore of it. And I remember the main guy, Jeffrey Combs, obviously playing Herbert West, very distinctive looking bloke. And I remember watching it, let's say a few times, maybe 3-4 times or something like that. again. When you're a kid, you got so much free time, haven't you? You can watch movies
Yeah.
over and over. But coming into this, I remembered practically nothing about the story, you know, beyond kind of just what the basic concept was. So yeah, I'd seen that first one, but none of the sequels at all. So I was kind of, in particular for the memory of that first one. That's why I stuck my hand up first. I was like, yeah, I quite fancy going back. And it's definitely one of those that I've not revisited, you know, not gone back and thought, oh yeah, I'll watch that again. So I was intrigued to see how it'd stand up. And like I say, I had the beautiful kind of coming together of the nostalgia of it and still being surprised with the story.
Not knowing the full thing.
Exactly, yeah. So it's a rare thing, that, isn't it? Where
yeah, there's only a few things where it's it often comes like, you know, you remember a cover. You know, like you say that you say about the man in the boot. Like we had a van. There was a guy in a van. Like he had like a proper little sort of like dinky van, and he opened up the back, and there was like a DVD select or some VHS selection in the back of that. And he had a locked bit. You know, like you'd have the in the video store, it'd be the beaded curtain.
Behind the
he had like a suitcase, a locked suitcase in the corner of the van, which was the equivalent of his beaded curtain. But yeah, no, like there's always those films that sort of there are films I remember more for having seen the case or the artwork and stuff, or even just its reputation, rather than seeing the film. And this was one of those films for me where I was like, I've heard of this film so often. And I did watch it, I think, but I watched it, I think, sort of in the 90s. It's one of those ones I remember catching on TV, but you sort of like caught glimpses of it. And it wasn't until a bit later that I sort of really watched it. But it's an interesting film as well, because it's sort of, you said about the sort of the 80s, like the horror was a big genre in the 80s, like, you know, apart from the icons, like it was the slasher genre, but also it's sort of like the splatter decade as well. So there's like, you got all that sort of like splatter gore stuff, and this is like prime right in the middle of that, like 1985. We're getting into that sort of splatter, you know, gore horror, and directed by Stuart Gordon, and produced by Brian Usner, and Bride obviously directed by Brian Usner, but Brian Usner was like and Stuart Gordon at the forefront of that. Like they were sort of like, how much blood and stuff can we just get on the screen? I think Brian Usner also did. There's a film called Society, which is another one.
Saw that one as well. Yeah.
Yeah. Again, I saw the cover and I was like, I've got to see that film. And so yeah, this is one of those, like I say, going back, and I've got these not in heavy rotation, but I do like this trilogy. I think it's sort of like one of the weirder ones. So it does stand out, and the films are, you know, they stand up. I think they stand up pretty well. We'll get into that. But one of the things also to note about this, from my perspective as well, is I've always been a fan of H.P. Lovecraft. And so this sort of, you know, is a Lovecraft story. And in many cases, this is probably, from his writing, the only one where he sort of tries to do, comedy is probably too strong a word, but there's like a bit of satire in the story. And the story, it was serialized, is based like a series of sketches, and the first two films are basically sort of like a collection of those sketches that he's written about and just put together. So yeah, it's quite interesting to sort of see this sort of like purple prose sort of zombie horror from H.P. Lovecraft turned into this splatter gore film, sort of horror comedy from the 80s, which is quite cool. So yeah, they are interesting films in that sort of respect. But let's jump in. Let's go to start with Reanimator. So 1985, as I said, directed by Stuart Gordon, starring Jeffrey Combs as Herbert West, Bruce Abbott as Dan, Barbara Crampton as Megan, and Robert Sampson as Dean Halsey. And we've also got David Gale as Dr. Hill. So it's quite a relatively sort of small cast in that sort of respect. But basically, sort of just a quick story. So Herbert West, medical student working in Europe at the start of the film, him and another doctor are studying the effects of death and how death can be prevented, but also how to reanimate dead tissue. And he has this sort of fluorescent fluid, this solution that does the job. after after an incident in, I can't remember, it's like Germany or
it was Zurich, Switzerland.
Zurich, that's what, Switzerland, yes. He moves back to work at the Miskatonic University in Aachen and meets another medical student, Dan, and Herbert West, being the arrogant little sod that he is, starts to sort of call out their doctor, Dr. Hill, and his sort of theories. And eventually sort of Dan and Herbert sort of come together to start experimenting on reanimating dead tissue. This starts with a cat and escalates to humans, and eventually sort of a whole morgue full of people, including an animated head of Dr. Hill, we will get to, who returns in the best possible fashion in the second one. So let's talk about this then. So just as you said, sort of like Jeffrey Combs as the star of this. What are your thoughts then on Jeffrey Combs on this? Does he sort of strike you in any way? You know, does he stand out as a sort of an
100%, 100%. I think the performance. I mean, the whole movie. And I think the tone of the first and the second movies is a little bit different. I think everything gets ramped up to 11 in the second one, but I think in both of them, he's basically a Batman villain.
Yes,
like, he is a Batman mad scientist who is the absolute definition of having a god complex. You know, he thinks he can do everything better, and just the hammy way that he delivers some of these lines, he does make things funny that aren't, if you just read them on a page on the scripts, they're not really funny, but there's something about that kind of Batman villain way he delivers it. It makes him very endearing. Whereas, you know, he's kind of an endearing villain, really. Yeah. He's just not as bad a villain as you know, Dr. Hill later on. So no, I think he was undoubtedly the star of the show. And I couldn't really remember how we got to the point where he was the Reanimator. But straight away, when this film starts, no one can accuse it of luring you in. You know, what this is going to be right from the off, because you've got what I like to think of as Dr. Hans Gruber Senior. You know, as a connected universe to Die Hard. You know, you've got some really gory makeup, screaming away, you know, in agony, and you've got Herbert West there, who's saying, you know, oh, I've given too high a dosage or whatever, and getting dragged off, but then just suddenly, you know, for no reason, he's in the US and no charges are pressed or anything. So, yeah, but coming back to him, no, I thought he was absolutely brilliant and undoubted star of the show. And to me, everyone else is just a supporting cast to him.
Yeah, and that's a really good point, because he is. Like, it is. The film's called like Herbert West Reanimator, and it doesn't work without him. But I do like Jeffrey Combs. Sort of, he's one of those actors I find that what's the word? What's the phrase? Like, you know, he knew the assignment.
Yeah,
you know,
yeah.
He read this script. He obviously met with Stuart Gordon, and they were like, "This is your character. Like, you know, don't try and play this subtle. Like, there is no subtlety to be had here. Like, do whatever you want. Like, you know, where you think you want to go big, or do whatever." And I love it because he's so expressive. He's so sort of like you said, some of the delivery of the lines is like, you know, he's clearly sort of like gone a completely different way to how he sort of reminds me a little bit of, like, say, like Matt Berry, where like he'll deliver a line and you're like, yeah. I never thought anyone would deliver it that way. But he does. He has real sort of screen presence, because he's not like a big. The thing is, he's not like a big guy. Like, you know, his sort of partner in crime in this, Dan Kane, played by Bruce Abbott, is a bigger guy. Like, he's a sort of like, he's almost like typical B Hollywood actor, isn't he? Sort of like, you know,
yeah.
he's relatively good looking. He's you know, he's pretty athletic. He's the sort of like the good looking one of the two, and so he's intentionally sort of playing. He's the normal one, but like you say, Herbert West is definitely a mad professor. Like, he's a mad scientist, And I just love how unapologetic he is about the whole thing. And it gets, like you said, it ramps up in the second one, and we'll get to that because there's some scenes in that. But even like his, as you get to know him, like the lying and, you know, because the cat that's in the basically
in the
Dan's
fridge,
cat
in the beer fridge.
Yeah, and it's like he's like, oh, it got its head caught in a jar and it's suffocated, and like it's the kind of lie that like a 3-year-old would give. But I like the fact that he is so sort of like, you know, invested in it. When he's sort of challenged on it, he's like completely indignant the fact that he's been challenged on this nonsense lie. And
he Dan just swallows it whole, doesn't he? Dan's like, what happened? Meg's like, you know, always the voice of reason, isn't she, Megan?
Yes.
And she's like pointing out the obvious, like, what are you doing with this creep? He's clearly a madman. It's like, Dan, nah, he's all right, you know. If they'd have only listened to Megan, none of this would have happened.
Yeah. I like the fact, like I say, like with Meg as a character, like you say, she's the voice of reason. And Barbara Crampton, again, another one sort of like, you know, she's appeared in a number of, like, you know, she's like a scream queen, a number of horror films. But she plays that sort of like naive, you know, college student, co-ed kind of thing. And she's brilliant at it. But she's got like a purity is probably too strong a word, but she's got that sort of like girl next door kind of look.
All American girl.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so, you know, she's not portrayed as stupid. Like, she's clearly not stupid, but you know, but it's interesting that, like, yeah, she's just completely sort of like ignored throughout, because she's constantly like, now this guy's a lunatic and needs to be stopped, and everyone's like, well, all right, no, you know, he's just a bit odd, or he's a bit eccentric.
Did you ever watch The Fast Show at all?
Yes. Yeah.
So there was a lady character on that who would always point out the obvious. And one sketch in particular, I remember some guys have locked their keys in the car. And they're all talking around, discussing what can we do? And she walks up and she's like, well, I've seen this before. You know, you get a half, you know, you cut a tennis ball in half and then you slam it onto the lock, and then the pressure will unlock the door. And everyone just ignores her.
Yeah.
And then a couple of seconds later, someone else suggests like, I know what we should do. We should get a tennis ball, cut it in half, you know, and just repeats what she said.
Yeah. And everyone's like, that's a great idea.
Yeah.
Yeah. It is. It's totally that. That's exactly like she's there. It almost satirizes the sort of like the dumb blonde, because she's there and she is the one saying, like, you know, this is clearly wrong. He's clearly done something and no one's listening to us. So throughout the film, you are just like, if anything, it badges her for death, really, is the only thing. Sort of like, even the first time I remember watching this and thinking, like, either Herbert West is going to kill you or you're getting killed in the process of this, because it's all going to go wrong. You're too good for this film or for this story.
I think her job was, though, to walk in at the point just after something's been reanimated. That's her job throughout this movie, isn't it? Mostly.
Yeah, for the second half, that's clearly, like, you know, every time something goes wrong. I do want to say what you say about walking in. One of the other things you said about this being a Batman villain as well, thing, like that laboratory they have, like they choose a house to live in, and they have like a basement, and it's got a massive steel door. And it's, you know, and then they got this laboratory thing going on in the basement. It's so sort of it's so sort of typical, so sort of like, you know, rote almost, that it's not. It's almost like you know, you can tell it's almost joking, about it, that he is so sort of you know, mad scientist. You almost expect him to be like, it's alive. Go that big. He never quite goes there. But yeah, he is. He's fantastic. But one of the things, like you said as well, he's not, although he is he? Because he's not the hero. You know, so it's whether he's an anti-hero, because he's clearly the protagonist. We sort of, Dan is the access character. He's who we're sort of accessing this world through, and following along. But like as you said, sort of it's hard to say because like between Dr. Hill and Herbert West, like they are basically as bad as each other. It's just that we seem to like Herbert West more, I would say.
I think the reason I say he's kind of a villain, I'm not even saying. I mean, by the end, he's kind of half redeemable, but he's like killing people's pets and stuff, you know. So it's like, well, you can't really redeem that guy. And plus, this is almost like a cautionary tale, isn't it? And I'm sure there's been hundreds of thousands of stories written about, you know, the dangers of science and just letting scientists do whatever they want without any checks and balances in place. But he's just so arrogant, isn't he? You know, even when he comes into the university and, you know, you've got Dr. Hill and he's showing he's developed this laser for brain surgery and whatever. And he's just saying, oh, it's highly derivative of Dr. Gruber's work. And, you know, it's like you're filling these students' heads with nonsense kind of thing. It's like, God, you are a bit of an insufferable prat, aren't you?
Oh yeah, he's an absolute tool, isn't he? Really, like he is that kind of guy that you wouldn't want to meet him at a party. Or I don't think they ever go, but like he will happily tell you, like, you know, how great he is.
Can you imagine being stuck like at a house party or something in the corner and cornered by him and he's chewing your ear off about
reanimating dead tissue? You just like, oh, it's fascinating. It's fascinating. Yeah, I've got to go.
Yeah.
I've left the oven on. Yeah, it is interesting because you say about that sort of like, because he does kill. It's not just that because he does kill. He's obviously killed Dan's cat for the first bit. And I want to talk about that scene when he reanimates it in a minute. But also, like, he's opportunistic. Like he's clearly like very goal orientated. Like he just wants to do this one thing. And one of the key things that is like, you know, when Meg's father dies, Dean Halsey, because when they do the reanimation in the thing, like he's killed, and straight away he's like, fresh corpse. Like he's straight on it, like, you know, and happens to have a syringe with his reanimation solution in his pocket, and he's just like, no, I'm off. So yeah, he is. He's not particularly evil, is he? Because he thinks he's doing a good thing as well.
Most villains do.
Oh yeah,
I absolutely think in the 80s he is the hero, or he's one of the heroes. And like you say, Dan is the Access character, but I'm watching this in 2022 now, and I'm thinking, well, actually, you kind of caused all these problems here.
Oh yeah, yeah. There's a reason that by 3 he's in prison. You know, he causes all of this. But like I say, but Dr. Hill's that slightly but Herbert West is the slightly lesser of two evils. And in Dr. Hill, we have someone who is just as arrogant as a teacher, but also when he actually witnesses, he figures out the sort of the reanimation, he sees fame and fortune. Whilst Herbert West never really talks about fame and fortune, he is actually more about just the achieving of science.
It's the science, isn't it?
Yeah, which, you know, he feels like at the end, the ends justify the means. And while Dr. Hill is a bit more cutthroat in it.
He's also a massive seedy fucker as well.
Yeah. Well, I want to talk. You say about this. One of the things I want to ask about later is how problematic do we find some of this film? Because there's some scenes, especially that, you know, when he's headless later on, and I'm just like, oh my God! Like
the answer is very problematic.
Yes. Yeah, because like I say, he clearly has, you know, affections for Meg, and sort of, you know, isn't shy about showing it. He keeps trying to sort of put her off Dan and says, "Oh, you know, why don't you study at home tonight? So you know, we can sort of continue our conversations." And these other sleazy comments.
Oh God, when he's talking to the dean, like her dad, and she comes in and it's like serving them dinner for some reason, and he's like, "Why haven't you grown?" And, "Oh, you are beautiful," and it's like, fucking hell. And I don't know. I was watching this on YouTube, and so I'm not sure if this was the unrated or the R-rated version. I know there's a couple out there, but the way the camera sort of sat on him, and let's face it, he's like a Poundland Christopher Lee, isn't he?
Yes, I was going to say it's a great comparison. That is a fantastic comparison. Yeah.
So the way the camera had him and the lighting and everything seemed to imply to me he was hypnotizing the Dean.
It's funny, isn't it? Because it plays up certain aspects of Dr. Hill that never seem to pan out. Like you said, like he it's almost like they light him, and I think I see what you're saying, because obviously it does focus in on like you almost got that bar, don't you? Sort of like the lit bar across his eyes.
Like when Dracula used to hypnotize someone.
Yeah. I think they're sort of just trying to use it to show that he is a sleazy fucker.
Yeah.
Really, for all intents and
I
purposes.
couldn't remember if you swore on this podcast. Sorry.
Yeah. Fuck it. So he is clearly like he is, like you say, that's sleazy, and that pays off later. But yeah, and then he's clearly willing to take advantage, because obviously we'll get to the morgue scene as well, because they do try and reanimate a corpse, and it goes wrong, and this massive bloke sort of is reanimated and just goes berserk and starts sort of attacking. And Dean Halsey comes in. First, he's crushed by a door, and then
brilliant,
yeah, and then sort of like he's killed. But funny enough, when I was watching this, and sort of Ellie and my daughter gone to bed, and Alex was just doing some stuff in the house, I was like, okay, I'm gonna put this on. And she walked in, and she never really. Alex isn't big on these films, doesn't really watch them. Just walked in on this scene where the guy gets crushed by the door and stuff, and she's like, "What are you watching? Like, what is this?" And it's not a film that's easy to explain. So I was like,
no,
it's just a horror film. Don't worry about it.
It's like outtakes from the Hulk.
Yeah,
he did look like a bit like Lou Ferrigno, didn't he? The size of him. They picked the biggest. I know he might have been the freshest, but could have picked a little granny to try it out on or something.
Yeah, it's one of those things that they never seem to learn. Like, they constantly seem to pick the wrong thing to animate. But again, it's one of those things where the special effects. I want to talk about the effects in this, because the gore effects, because there are quite a few. There's makeup effects mainly, because this is pre CGI. As we often comment on for this period. So it's all sort of like makeup effects and just buckets and buckets of blood and stuff. And so you do get sort of like, but it's almost like it's a double-edged sword, this, because you do later on get some, I want to get to, there's more we're talking about later on. You get a severed head that talks, and I think some of that is really well done. But the first thing we really get to see, skipping back to the beginning, is when the cat has died, and it is reanimated. You talk about Meg walking in. The first thing that Dan does is walk in, and Herbert West is being attacked by the reanimated cat. Clearly, it's not a real cat. It's just a toy. But that scene where he's sort of like rolling around the basement, being sort of what are your thoughts on that? Because that's a bit of a doozy.
I think one of the thoughts is Dan is incredibly impressionable, because he doesn't put up much resistance at all, does he? I mean, no. Herbert just spins him a line, and he's like, "Oh right, I didn't see it like that before," and then goes with it. Yeah. I thought the actual sound cracked me up, the sound of the cat, because it was clearly just exactly. It doesn't sound too dissimilar. It's clearly just an actor, putting on this cat noise. And what it made me think, because I haven't read much Lovecraft. I've heard you talk about it on the podcast a lot, but I just thought, well, did Stephen King just completely rip Lovecraft for Pet Sematary?
Not just Pet Sematary.
Yeah.
yeah. No, there's a lot. The more you read, the more you go, all right, yeah. No, that's where sort of like, yeah. So there's definitely like Stephen King, and he admits, similar like Clive Barker. Like you read them and you go, okay, like I see where you've got that from.
Yeah. But I think again, it's quite a scary scene, because they've got the light kind of swinging around, haven't they? Which gives it a really nice kind of scary effect, and you're not sure because bits of the room are dark.
Yeah.
But when, what confused me again, Dan, he makes some strange choices.
Yeah.
So he kind of thinks, oh, maybe the cat's not dead. It was in the fridge. It was just maybe its heart, its vitals had all slowed down or whatever.
What
So
a
he
terrible
decides,
medical student he is.
he is awful because he also decides to try and catch the cat by swinging after it with a baseball bat.
Yeah.
And I'm like, well, what was your plan exactly there?
Yeah.
And when he does eventually, throw it against the wall, and great effect, because you see the cat splatter against the wall and you get a bit of matter left on the floor. And then they go through this dialogue about, brought the cat back to life. Dan's trying to rationalize it. And then you get that moment, don't you, when Herbert's like, so you believe he's dead now, kind of thing. And then reanimates it then. And I thought the effects for that were brilliant. Now, not in a that looks real kind of way, but you can tell it's not real, but so gory, and the noise coming out of the cat as well. You're thinking, well, do these reanimated corpses feel pain? Because that looks pretty painful, and the noise coupled with the sound, and it's kind of shaking as it's screaming kind of thing. It's like really haunting. I thought that was really well done, and that was one of the scenes that really stuck with me for a few days after.
No, I agree with that. It's a really good point, because it sets some stuff later on where you do start to question things. Where, like you say, you see that cat, and like you said, the reaction to it being animated a second time, and it is that thing of like, this clearly isn't a humane thing to be doing. This cat's clearly like, having some sort of sensory overload or whatever with its now it's been animated, its nervous system is obviously reacting to it. And so you know that going in, it's sort of like, they tell you that. So when you do see things like, in particular, sort of like Dean Halsey, when he's killed and then reanimated, and he's obviously goes, I don't want to say goes insane, like he's clearly not damaged. It's quite tragic. And you're just like, like he's clearly in there in some capacity, and he's trapped in there. Like, they keep him alive in that padded room. It makes you sort of like, although it's sort of like something that's played for comedy, there are moments like when Meg is talking with Dr. Hill, and he's just sort of had Dean Halsey's in that room, and then he's sort of like headbutting the glass.
Yeah.
And you're just sort of like, this is still like a horror comedy, but like this is where the horror sort of comes through. Like you do sort of feel it. And you're like, this is really quite twisted. Like,
oh, absolutely. And even before that, because when he does reanimate the Dean, and he's attacking the two guys, but then Meg shows up and he starts cowering in the corner, doesn't he? So
yes, he reacts to his daughter.
Yeah, exactly. There is that bit of love in him, and he's ashamed. He kind of knows what he's become and is ashamed of it. So again, I thought that was quite, I don't quite know what the right word is, moving. It is a bit emotional, really, because one of the reasons I think I'm never a particularly good watcher of horror is I just empathize too much. For a character like that, I'm thinking, oh crikey, can you imagine being in that position? And it was quite horrible, that bit, I thought.
It's interesting because one of the things that sort of, especially in these horrors, especially in this first one, it's less so in the follow-ups, because they sort of lead into the sort of the comedy probably a bit more. But we've often, I think you and I may have spoken about this, but I've spoken about it with other people. There are films that sort of like have that action comedy or whatever sort of like balance. And they often sort of like, in my opinion, sort of like undercut a dramatic or action scene by then adding a joke. And I often feel that with like Thor Ragnarok is probably one of my greatest examples. Like, great film, but it often undercuts moments of dramatic tension by then adding in a joke. And I feel like this almost does the opposite. Like, it gives you, like, it rams it up to 10 or 11 with some, like, some splatter craziness, but then completely undercuts it by introducing some, like, an emotional gut punch where you are like, oh man, the reanimated corpse going crazy. It's her father, and he still recognizes her as such, and so reacts to her presence. And you're sort of like, yeah, Jesus, that's not great. Then you say, so you get that empathy. throughout. So you're right, and I love the fact that it does that, because it could just rely on gore, 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 and it's there like throughout, but it does often have those moments of empathy, or where you are made more to be sympathetic with a character. So, and it does really well at that, and I think the cast are good at doing that as well.
Yeah, and I think the trap that a lot of sequels fall into for me is that the second one always takes the feedback from the first one. So it's like you've got a marketing group, and they're asking people, oh, what are the 5 things you like about this movie? And then the sequel becomes about those five things.
Yeah.
So the different layers and the different tones and notes that the first one hits are just omitted from the second one. Lethal Weapon is one that I went back to, where the second one is a great comedy action movie, but it's not got nearly the emotional weight
impact
of the first one.
No, yeah, I agree. And by the time you get to the fourth one, it's very,
it's almost like a parody of itself, isn't it?
Yeah.
So, and a lot of sequels do that, and we'll get on to Bride a little bit later.
The greatest example of that to me is always the Die Hard franchise, just to say that. So you start with Die Hard, where a bit of broken glass almost finishes John McClane in the first film, and then by the fifth one, he's flying helicopters through buildings and all kinds of stuff. You're like, yeah, same franchise, this.
Exactly, with Hans Gruber Jr., of course.
Yes, yeah. Hans Gruber the second. So yeah, well, you do get those constant cuts. So you do, like I say, you sympathise with Meg, and she becomes again like another sort of Axis character. She's determined to find out what happened to her father, and so she's been given some agency. So again, she is just that thing of walking in, but she has got her own agency. Like, she is trying to investigate, and so she is a threat to Herbert West. And I think one of the reasons I sort of understand that she's not so much for the chopping block, but she is in possible danger of being killed, is you see at one point when Herbert's work is threatened. So when Dr. Hill basically sort of says, well, I know what you've done now, and so I'm going to be taking this solution, and I know how you've done it, and I'm going to become witch famous. Like, his instant response, he grabs the shovel, knocks him out, and then decapitates him with that shovel.
It's not a normal response, is it?
We keep saying going up to 11. It's one of those things, one of the things I've learned myself is they say you should respond, not react. You sort of take that moment to take a breath and respond. And this is one of those cases of pure reaction. He just grabs it and belts him. But again, you talk about sort of the effects. And the humor as well. This is one of those moments of dark humor. This has got, because the film is loaded with humor. He takes the head and it looks great, and he sort of sat and he's got I don't know, like a petri dish, but it's like a medical tray, isn't it? He puts them in a steel medical tray, and it just keeps falling over.
I thought that was great.
So he gets the note spike, takes the notes off, puts it, and then just lamps it on top of that, and it stands there. And I was like, yeah, that's a great moment of just subtle but very dark humor. And obviously he then brings back just the head, proving that which we'll get into in the second film, sort of like is lent into more, is this idea that, and it's proved in this film, consciousness doesn't just exist in the brain.
Yeah.
Every part, he can reanimate body parts. So the head comes back, as does the body. So he puts them into the heart and some into the head, and then they start to act as a team. But like you say, you get the moment where he talks with the head, and it's all done well. It's clear how it's done, isn't it? Like, there's a hole for the table, and it's all done. But what do you think? Like that thing when the head starts talking, is that sort of like, because other people have said that's the sort of the jumping the shark, like this thing of
So for me, it makes me feel nostalgia for those old school effects, where you can literally see this is how they've done it. They've got cut a hole in the table, stuck his head through, put a bit of, latex and blood around him, and that's how they've done it. Because it's so different, obviously, when he's just got, and even the weight of the head, you can tell it's not very heavy. He sticks it on the note spike thing. But I just thought it was great. And just before I forget, that one of the other things that I think is good about the writing for this is they've already put work into setting the characters up. So the whole, even though that interaction at the lecture where you've got Herbert and he's snapping his pencils and what have you, and he's having a go at Dr. Hill for basically being a plagiarist.
Yes.
So it's set him up. It's saying this guy will steal other people's work. And so, you know, when he's threatening to steal Herbert's work, he has to take him seriously. So I thought that was pretty good the way they set that up, and then there's a payoff. But also, even with Dan as well, I joke, I mean, he goes along with Herbert way too easy.
Yeah.
But when we first meet Dan, he's desperately trying to save that woman.
Yes.
He doesn't want to accept, you know, when he loses patience. So he's kind of set up to be impressionable, you know, for Herbert to come along later.
Yeah, well, especially the idea of reanimation, this idea that, you know, death isn't the end anymore. Like it's perfect for Dan. You almost want a bit more of that. Then, like, why is he like that? Like, has he lost a parent young or something like that? Like, you know. But yeah, no, I do agree. I like
Could
that
be a prequel one day.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah. In the book, in the story, it's written in the first person, so the story is told by the character that would be Dan. Like, he's not named in the book. Like, the story doesn't name him. He's just the narrator. Okay. But he is sort of like, he refers to himself as sort of Herbert West's enthralled assistant. So like, he acknowledges that he was sort of in this sort of personality sort of you know, that he couldn't escape from, an impressionable, because the book, the novel covers, I think, 10 years. So it's not a short term, like, you know, they basically do something and have to move somewhere else, or, you know,
right.
And it culminates in it culminates basically in the end of partly in the end of Bride of Reanimator, more so than this film. But yeah, like I say, he reanimates the head, and the body comes and they knock him out, and then you get a great scene of which is, by the way, but some of this is straight from Lovecraft. So the moment when the head and the body then go to the morgue, and the head is in the bag, and he's using a anatomical medical dummy head and a trench coat and stuff. That's sort of from the novel. From the
really?
book. In the book, there's a character that is called Hill, but he's a soldier, a medical medic soldier, and he's killed after being beheaded, and he uses a wax bust in place of a head, and it's that's described, and it often refers to how he sort of, you know, this angelic face and the lips didn't move, but a voice that seemed to come from the box he was carrying. And so I love that sort of comes up again. But he goes,
worst security guard ever, though, isn't he? That guy.
Yes. I still kind of love him, though. I do. I think
he's great. He is great, but Christ, I wouldn't want him guarding my stuff.
I love his approach. Like, he clearly took this job because it's the easiest job possible. Because he's like, no one's getting out, and no one really wants to get in. So there's no real need to be here. But what he's doing is, obviously he's actually also he's kidnapped Meg, or he ends up taking Meg, and so you have this bit at the end where he gets her onto a gurney in the morgue. I'm never entirely sure what he's intending to sort of do with her, but like, I get big parts of
like
it.
What the end plan is?
Yeah, like, why here? So he sort of like, he obviously has her, and he's obviously starting to reanimate the other corpses as well. We find out he's reanimated the corpse in the room, but he strips Meg naked. And again, this is clearly like one of those 80s films where they're just sort of like, we're getting to the climax, boobs. And so she's laying there, and then this is where it becomes problematic, because let's be fair, this is tantamount to, but it's sexual assault, basically. And it's one of those things, again, there's films from where you see sort of like, you know, you have these sort of sex scenes or whatever in films, you're like, you know, I often think like how embarrassing that must be for the actors to do that kind of thing. You got like, it's not just them. This isn't a scene of passion. They've got like your director, your cameraman, your sound man. You got like a boom mic hanging over your head, and all this other stuff. Like, it must be like incredibly unsexy to be sort of doing that kind of thing. But in this one, basically, you have the head. And again, they've done it relatively well. I think the effects are good. But he proper goes for it. Like, he is sucking on boob and bits.
Yeah.
And they're about to sort of, and they have the dummy head that's going to go between her legs and stuff. But I don't know. This felt really, although he's villainous and stuff, like this felt kind of really problematic for me watching it in 2022. I don't know. What were your thoughts on this whole sort of Meg thing?
I felt it was too far. I felt like we didn't need to see that. I mean, we'd already set him up. He's a lecherous old fucker. He's literally the same age as her dad. And, you know, is not shy about, you know, professing his love. And again, the dialogue, he's talking about loving her and stuff like this. It's like, look, you just want to shag her. You don't love her. You know? Yeah. But when the head is kind of, you know, basically sucking on her boobs kind of thing and then kissing her, it's just horrifying, you know, to watch. And then the bit where, I mean, it is done for shock value. It is. You know, it does what they set out to do, but I just think it's too far for me. Those kind of things can be done off panel, if you like. We didn't. It doesn't make him any more villainous than we already thought he was.
No, exactly. Yes. Yeah. And so, but he is interrupted literally before going down on it as a severed head, which is freaky as anything, by Herbert West, who then starts to sort of like, you know, belittle him and distract him.
I love that. Yeah. I had the is it there? Oh no, it's before, isn't it? Again, it's just his delivery is like, who's going to believe a talking head? Get a job in a sideshow. Like, just you read it and it's not that funny, really, just as the words. No, but it's the way he delivers it. It's just brilliant.
He's so arch and so sort of like, he is fantastic. And so his delivery is what makes it, like, especially when I say he's talking with Dr. Hill. And then, so you do get the sense of where they confront him and he brings all the corpses to life. And so they all attack and there's a bit of like an all-out zombie attack at this point. And I kind of like this sort of end bit where they're all sort of fighting and going at it. But it also brings back this sort of sympathy thing, because in the chaos of it all, we have the reanimated Dr. Dean Halsey, and it's him that sort of intervenes to sort of save the day. So, you know, again, it's that thing of that touchy moment, like, you know, he's still in there, and he intervenes. And if I'm right, like a gas gets released, and there's all sorts of stuff going on, and everyone's sort of fighting. And Meg is killed, and obviously that hits Dan, and then sort of, it sort of, I say, goes full circle, because then Dan carries her out of the room, because you're not sure what's happened to Herbert either. Like, Herbert West, it's sort of suggested that they're all
sure he died.
Well, there's a sequel, so
no, I know, but we'll talk about the continuity when we get to Bride, I'm sure.
Yeah, we will. But yeah, it's suggested that the zombies all sort of like ripped into pieces, isn't it? Or the reanimated corpses, and he carries out Meg and takes her to the table. Realize she's not dead, and they're all sort of going like, "She's dead, let her go." And he has the bag. He has a bag that contains the reanimation solution. But so that's sort of the end. What were your thoughts on sort of the this climax with all the?
So, for some reason, there's a lot that stuck with me in this first one. I think I've got more kind of thoughts, and I think the first one is so much better written than what we'll get onto, because again, when they reanimate that guy, the Lou Ferrigno massive bodybuilder, they're going through the different corpses and they talk about, well, this one's burned, this one's gunshot to the head, you know, so they rattle off all these bodies that they don't want to reanimate, so not good candidates. And when Hill reanimates them, they all pop up because he'd been working on removing the will or controlling the will or something, hadn't he? So again, that's how he can control these guys. Don't know why Hill is just himself. Everyone else becomes a ravenous zombie. But you get these guys and they pop up and they're what Herbert described earlier. I was like, that is clever, and you sort of think, well, they haven't just thrown this together, because it could have been anything. They've deliberately set it up there, and then there's a payoff later. And when they all pop up, that's you're like, holy crap! How are they going to get out of this one, kind of thing? And then, it was good the way it all sort of panned out. I was under. Well, I was actually confused because I was thinking, well, Hill is definitely dead. Herbert's definitely dead. How are they going to make a sequel? And I was thinking, well, when he goes to reanimate Meg, he gets the old luminous. It's the things, isn't it? It's that luminous liquid.
Or glow stick.
Yeah, glow stick liquid. Yeah. But so iconic for this franchise. And when he reanimates Meg, I'm thinking, well, how is this going to play out in the sequel? Because we're going to have a reanimated Meg. I'm going to assume she's the bride. And you've got the other two guys. Are they going to reanimate them? What's going on there? So, yeah, I was intrigued. And like I say, a lot of this stuck with me. And actually, I was thinking I only watched it the once. No, I think I watched it the twice. I literally watched it and then watched it again the day after, because I wanted to go through and just make sure, all the little bits that I hadn't picked up, it all made more sense. So no, I really enjoyed it. It was really good.
The first one, I think, isn't for me. It's one of those underrated classics, sort of horror classics of the 80s. I think, there's a lot of others that get sort of like, highlighted. Everyone gets overlooked because of the slashers. But yeah, I think the first one particularly, I'd say you're right, the writing and the continuity in the film and the performances are just spot on. Like, they know what they're doing. They know what film they're making. And so they never really take themselves too seriously, but like, when they do want to hit you with something, they do. They'll give you that bit of an emotional gut punch. And so I like the fact that they do that. But you're right, I love this first film. One thing that's interesting, actually, is the soundtrack, the musical score.
The Psycho.
The Psycho. It's basically the Psycho soundtrack. Yeah. I was hoping you noticed it. Yeah, because you're watching the opening credits. Even then, you're like, huh. I'm assuming someone must be getting paid for this, but it's a little, it's a little odd.
Yeah, I think it was Alan Moore, wasn't it, who said when he was writing Watchmen that if he changed those characters that he'd originally planned to use, if he wrote them in a way that was still familiar, readers would still feel like it was familiar. They'd kind of recognize those characters, and then they'd be more emotionally invested. And I kind of think with the Psycho soundtrack there, they were trying to do the same thing. They were just basically ripping it off. And I don't know, I think if you did that today, lawyers would be all over it.
Yeah.
I don't know if they got away with it there. If it was just,
I think it's gone under the radar. It feels like it's gone under the radar a bit. And
yeah. So
it's one of those things that, like,
you had like Snow White being played in Gremlins and stuff, didn't you?
Yeah.
So I just don't think they were as all over copyright like they are today.
Yeah. It's one that I think Disney at that point was probably more like, if anyone could advertise it, I'm happy that it's just getting out there.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it wasn't prolific for them back then, was it?
No. But you're right. So how do they follow this up? Well, Bride of Reanimator comes out 5 years later. This time, Stuart Gordon has sort of like stepped out. It's directed by Brian Usner. We have the same cast back: Jeffrey Combs, Bruce Abbott. We now have Claude Earl James as Lieutenant Chapman, Fabiana Udinu as Francesca, David Gale back as Dr. Hill, Kathleen Kinmott as Gloria, and Mel Stewart as Dr. Graves. It's a bit of a replay of what's going on, but the film opens in a war zone, and we find that both Herbert and Dan are now field medics in a conflict. Unknown, not sure where they're in conflict. They reanimate a soldier. It goes all a bit pear-shaped. They get sort artillery fire, and so they decide to go home to Arkham and Miskatonic University, where they are welcomed back, apparently, after everything that went on. Not a problem. Carry on. Now working in the sort of the hospital. But it's unclear how long after the events of the first film, the second film, I don't know if it's supposed to be 5 years, because there is a detective looking into it. Do they say at any point?
I thought it was 8 months. I thought it said right at the start. And I was thinking, well, they were in medical school like 8 months ago. So it was a bit strange.
But yes, they do. Yeah, they do go back. I don't think re-enlist, but they seem to be working in a hospital again. And there's a Lieutenant Chapman looking into he calls it the Miskatonic Massacre that happened at the hospital. And again, Dan gets involved with another woman, Francesca, and Dr. Graves, who works in the hospital. I kind of like this guy. I think he's a great character. Basically collected the bits that were left and is keeping them in storage. And that includes the severed head of Dr. Hill. And so anyway, Herbert West is now sort of like, he's expanded his research. Again, they are back in a sort of the Addams family, but it's old morticians or something. They have a much bigger basement. But now, instead of looking at reanimating a single body that has died, he is looking to reanimate parts, organs. Basically, we are a machine made of parts, and each one has an element of consciousness and personality. So he wants to put together a body made of parts, a la Bride of Frankenstein, and reanimate it. And they do that by collecting sort of like the feet of a ballerina, the hands of, I think, a lawyer, and some other bits and pieces. Like, they've got all these bits and pieces. But yes, they are building this body. But in the meantime, Herbert is also tinkering with body parts and makes a small spider-like character out of fingers and an eye, which weirdly was copied in Red Dwarf using Crichton, who had a hand.
Oh yeah, I was wondering where I saw that from before. Yeah.
And then he does other ones where he puts like an arm and a leg together at one point. And then he puts like a forearm on a dog later on. So he's trying all kinds of things. This is where it gets weird. So obviously, eventually they reanimate the bride, and it all goes wrong, as can be expected. But then, so you've got Bride of Reanimator. And so, Dave, what are your thoughts overall before we sort of get into it of Bride of Reanimator?
My first thought was, even though they were familiar characters, familiar actors that we'd seen, there was almost no continuity from the end of the first one to where we pick you up in the second one. You know, Meg at the end of the last one was being reanimated. I have no idea what really happened to her after that. Herbert, he was dead. That was the implied thing at the end, even though we didn't see it on camera. So it's the old thing, if you didn't see it, did it really happen? Yeah. So, but it just seemed bizarre. And the thing that made me laugh right at the start, I suddenly thought, well, was the first one based in the 50s or something? Because they're now in Vietnam was my initial thought. But no, it's just some unnamed conflict, isn't it? And it made me laugh because they're in this tent, where not particularly concealed or anything, and they just decide to reanimate this guy, and who turns into some ravenous zombie and is trying to kill Herbert, and he ends up having to shoot him. And I'm thinking, how many times have you tried this? And every time someone tries to kill you, and they're like, right, next time the body wasn't fresh enough or something like that, So it did make me laugh. Again, like the first one, it just throws you straight in there, doesn't it? And, in terms of the gore, it definitely picks up where it started from. Now, I don't know if you know any, I couldn't find anything giving a reason for the 5-year gap, between the first one coming out in 85 and this one coming out in 90. But I get the impression that it probably was just a bit of a VHS hit more so than in the cinema. And again, that's why I think I made the comment before about they've just took the 5 things, what are the things that you love, and people tell us that you love about the first one, right? Let's just put loads of that into this one.
Yes.
And I think it just ramps everything else up a notch further. So whereas, in the first one, we reanimate a head. Okay, we can kind of get that because that's where your brain is. But then when he starts, he just basically gets the hand and sticks the eye on it, like you say, and then just puts a bit of glue over it. There's lots of hand wavy science, isn't there? And it becomes its own sentient little thing. You're like, oh right, okay, this is definitely gone off.
We're going into a different direction. Yeah, we're going. Like you say, it's more gore and humor, isn't it? Like even like Coombs's performance. Like there's moments when he's sort of like, because he's reanimating a hand, isn't he? He's testing this hand. And then he has a leg. Oh, he's reanimating a leg, isn't he? And then he sort of sees he's got this massive, like, meaty forearm. And he's just like, huh.
Yeah.
Huh. Yeah. And he gets a rod and sort of shoves him in. There's nothing there other than to have the moment where it's then together and the hand slaps him and the foot kicks him and then he basically has to get rid of it. So it's there. It's literally to set up a gag and that's it. And they do that several times in the story. But yeah, it is that sort of humor rather than the empathetic emotional hits. They sort of try for it later, but it never worked. However, they also, as you say, are upping the gore and sort of like, I wouldn't say horror because it's more the gore. But we talked about the effects in the last one and how it sort of like, it makes you nostalgic for that sort of like pre-CGI sort of thing. And there's some in this as well. I want to get to some particular ones in a bit, but like, what are your thoughts on sort of like the gore and the effects in this? Do you think this one stands up just as well?
I think we see a bit of a transition here. I actually didn't look at what the budget was before, but let me get it here. 2.5 million. First one was 2 million, I think. So equivalent budget, but I think they've gone much more down the kind of animation, and there's a bit of stop motion animation as well, isn't there? And I think it just doesn't really hold up as well. I think this looks much more like a TV movie for me than the first one. I agree with what you said before. I think the first one is a classic, even though I've not watched it for years. It just feels like a classic. I think that one of the things that hasn't helped it is probably just people dressing up. If you can dress up as Freddy Krueger, you can dress up as Jason,
yes,
Leatherface and whatever. But do you want to dress up as the Doctor? I guess you could have a little luminous green syringe. Yeah. that would do it. But the second one just has that feeling of a TV movie, and I just think the animation type gore as well just doesn't really help it. At this time, though, in 1990, I don't know how they get around that, because what they did in the first one, like you say, with reanimating bodies, in fact, in the first one and the second one, when they do reanimate whole bodies, and you can see that people have got they're made up to have decaying skin. People are like, oh, maybe they've just got mental illness kind of thing. It's like, are you not seeing what I'm seeing? They do it all the time, don't they? It's like, you guys are crazy. But yeah, I don't know at this time how they could do the different body parts and how it all works. In fact, the only one where they have the different body parts where you get the dog and you get the bloke's hand just coming out again. Brilliant. I love that.
It's proper like meaty forearm attached to a dog.
Probably about the equal weight of the dog. That was brilliant. So yeah, I think it's just unfortunate for the time. I don't see how they could achieve what they could with the different body part monster type things with the tools that they had at the time.
No, I get what you mean, and I think you're right. I think it feels like, and this isn't a cash grab because there's no cash to grab. The first one made money, but like you said, I think more as a cult film and sort of a VHS hit. I have a weird feeling this may have been straight to video or straight to
I don't see a box office number for it, so I think you're right.
And you're right, it has that feel to it, doesn't it? Where they're like, like, we're not going to give it the full money, but we can still do something with it. But the other thing as well is like they've clearly chosen certain effects. They're like, right, this is our money shot. This is the one we're going to go for later in the film. But you're right. It also then means that there are other shots and there are other effects that don't come across well. Dr. Hill returns as a severed head later on. Like he is reanimated and he is rested in a tub of blood to sort of restore him, I think, which is what sort of suggested.
I think wasn't the tub of blood the first one where you have the body? Actually, I didn't comment on that. I thought the bit where he puts the head down and then it's just the body, the headless body, and he's kind of bumping into things. I thought that was brilliant because again, Dr. Hill's just facial expressions, you get the kind of eye roll. I thought that was brilliantly comedic, but no, I don't remember him going in a kind of bloodbath in this one. I remember that one from the first one.
Okay, and I'm sure it's because Dr. Graves gets a syringe of the what's it solution.
Oh, maybe.
And he brings him back and he says more, and he gives him more of the solution. And then he says blood, and he squeezes like random blood, like not worried about what blood type you are, just blood. No, there you go.
Yep. Has a little orgasm, doesn't he?
Yeah, as he sort of absorbs it. And
takes a deep breath as well through his lungs that he doesn't have.
Yeah, that was the thing that keeps it. How is he talking? Because half his throat's gone. Like, it doesn't make any sense. But one of the things this is, and you say about how sort of like ridiculous this film goes. It does. It has this notion of body parts can be reanimated on their own, as we've said, like fingers and eyes and forearms and bottom half of the legs, that sort of thing. But the other part that's is also the fact that you can connect them. So you can have these sort of, like you say, sentient things with fingers and an eye. And they sort of take that to the next level later on because you are then introduced. And this is sort of more towards the end, but I'm going to jump the gun a bit because it's all part of it. You were introduced to Dr. Hill later on in the film. And again, you said about the things they've introduced. They've reanimated a bat previously. And now they've taken those bats' wings and they've attached them to Dr. Hill's head. And so he's able to fly around like something out of Doom.
It's so brilliant.
Yeah, but it's ridiculous. But again, they're obviously using rear projection kind, like he must be like below his neck. He's like in a green bodysuit or something like that. And so I can imagine the actor sort of, what's his name? David Gale to sort of go like bobbing around, like, his head sort of like moving. He must have felt like an absolute tit.
I thought that, I mean, that's the very first opening shot in the movie, isn't it? And I thought he was probably still like with his holly, just a black jumper on. And I thought it was actually the camera that was probably moving around.
That's a very good point. Yeah, quite possible. Because they do have that. Yeah, that's a good way of doing it. But there are those little tricks I do kind of enjoy. Yeah, even if they are a little bit like, all right, it's a bit cheesy and it looks silly, but I'm kind of enjoying this.
I do appreciate, again, cards on the table. I don't think this is as good as the first one.
No.
But it's got some really cool moments in it. And the fact they've set you up with gluing different body parts together, by the time he puts Hill onto the, he'd reanimated the bat, hadn't he? Mm-hmm. Chopped off its wings so it couldn't fly away and attack him and whatever. And when he pops Hill's head and the bat wings are there, you're like, oh, I see what's happening here.
Yeah. And that's it. It's sort of, there's indicators in this that they're not messing around. They're sort of like, okay, they're going for it now with this one. So what I do appreciate that what they're doing with that. But again, the other thing is we talk about Dan. Dan comes back and he meets Francesca, who is just so she's just a. What's disappointing you say about this is lesser. Like where in the first film, like Meg had not masses of agency. She was still there to be, a girlfriend and a sort of a damsel in distress, but like she had a purpose. Like she was connected to the story through both Dan and Dean Halsey. Like with Francesca, like she literally just sort of like walks in and she's just like, I'm pretty and supposed to be here.
Yeah.
And she she never really seems to fit the story like for the rest of the film. It's seriously like you're just like, okay, well, you're here to be the screamer in this sort of scenario. Like you've got no other real purpose. Which I just sort of find she's a much lesser than Barbara Crampton. I don't know what your thoughts are.
100%. And I think I messaged you, didn't I? Because I was watching it and I was like, I know her from somewhere. And then I was like, it's Halota Vagina from Austin Powers.
Yeah.
So I was sort of taken out of it a little bit then. But I agree. I mean, she's I don't think the writing is great in this. They've definitely focused on just, how weird can we get? But the actual story is paper thin, really.
Yeah.
And she's just there to provide some kind of conflict for Dan. But I'm at a loss to where Dan's heart really is. Is it with Meg?
Yeah.
Or he literally, he wants to reanimate Meg's heart in this, former patient's body or head at least, and then bits of other people. And then he's literally come from the other girl's bed downstairs, and then it's like, oh, come on, dude.
Yeah, that whole bit, like when Herbert introduces Meg's heart.
Yeah.
And I am, like you said, there's no continuity, because then I'm like, hang on, how the hell did you get hold of that? Like,
yeah,
I'm assuming then that Dan didn't reanimate her, at that part at the end of the credits in the last film. Fine. But she still would have been buried or whatever. So how is it fresh? Like, how have you still got this heart? Yeah. Like, why? And Dan seems to get attached to this idea of the heart having some sort of sentience, because obviously that's what we've sort of seen. But if it is, and this is this is, giving logic to where there is no logic really. But if the heart is what they're going to inject first and stuff, but they've still got every other body part, and they've already said, like, oh, there's a trace of personality and sentience in every body part. Like, okay, well, they're all separate then. So
it's not the same person, is it?
It's not the same person. Like, it's a combination. So yeah, I agree. Like, Dan sort of like fawning over this thing with the heart makes no sense, and it's actually a little irritating towards the end of the film.
I tell you what is strange is that the 180 that he does later, I know kind of probably skipped a whole bunch and just getting towards the end, but I think Herbert initially, he's talking like when the bride is fighting, his girlfriend, Fabiana, and Herbert's like, oh, look, she's got no chance, our being is superior or something like that. And then he says something about her just being pieces of dead flesh or something like that. It's like, that's a weird 180. Yeah. Also, Dan, he's been obsessed with reanimating, Megan's heart plus other bits. And then when she's actually alive, he does a complete 180 and he doesn't want to know her. And I thought that was pretty heartbreaking, actually. And that made me feel for the bride of Frankenstein sort of character there. So I thought it was pretty horrible and despicable of Dan the way he behaved there.
Well, this is the thing, isn't it? Like in the first one, you have that sort of like Dan is a bit of a pillock. He makes bad choices. He sort of follows the wrong people. In this one, like that continuation of it, that continuing to follow Herbert West is just ridiculous. But the fact is that he continues to make ridiculous choices like towards the end. And you're right, so when she is reanimated and sort of like she tries to give herself to him, and it's sort of like, I don't know, he's meant to be in some sort of trance, or has he gone some sort of like trauma, because then he realizes what she is, and she's like, is it just want my heart? And she tears her own heart out. And again, that's where like that's clearly one of the money shots in this, when the body the body starts to sort of like come apart and stuff. And I'm like, that's a great shot.
Oh yeah. The whole the whole body, the way it was done, and the way, again, because they've got that kind of, it's almost like a surrogate wedding dress, isn't it? It's like some kind of surgical see-through material, but I thought the way they kind of concealed, but you can see there's bits of exposed flesh under the skin and stuff. I thought it was really well done.
Yeah, I think that you can see where the money went for that sort of final effect. But the other thing I'll say is I like is the performance of the woman doing it, because it's a small part, like, you know, she has some bits to do, but when she is reanimated and stuff, like, she's clearly mimicking Bride of Frankenstein. You know, there's that sort of like bird-like movements and that sort of like look of shock and stuff. Like, she's going for a similar feel, and it works. Like, it works really well. I think I kind of like it. I don't know. What are your any final thoughts on that sort of The Bride?
I just think I don't think it was a cash grab as you say, but I think they had a thin idea, and it was basically to remake Bride of Frankenstein.
Yeah,
that in the Reanimator universe, if you like. I think that was it, and then they just came up with this kind of whatever it takes story to make this all happen. Again, some great moments in it. I just think as a story, it's just a bit flaky.
I think one of the problems is again, what do you do to follow up the ending of the last one? Like, how do you make it work? Like, they acknowledge, and like you say, the police story in this is like, is a detective. There's no detecting. Like, he knows they're involved, and he just basically wants to bully them and intimidate them into sort of giving something up. And I just find that kind of like makes me chuckle at times when he does sort of turn up and he's constantly sort of bullying them into doing things.
But I think he, again, getting back to Herbert West though, and Coombs's performance, it's one of my favourite lines is when he's almost Jim Carrey like. Yeah. I think he's light Jim Carrey, and he's like, he's a wife beater, Dan. Use the gun. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, this is the thing, I think, because again, this there's a moment in the original story which is obviously played out here in the second film, is Herbert West is so desperate to have a fresh body, and the sort of the narrator sort of comes back after being away for a couple of days, and he finds that there's this fresh body that, you know, was a traveler who had a sick heart and sort of just happened to die on when they came to see. He's looking for directions or something, and exhaustion made him die, but he's kept the body. But then when he reanimates him, he comes back and says, "Stay away from me, you whelp with that needle," and sort of like, so you know that Herbert West killed him to get the body. And I kind of like that they do that in this one as well, where sort of like he kills, he ends up killing the detective. Yeah. And then again, he can't help himself, where he's like, well, we could have him back on the beat.
Straight away. There's like, 30 seconds have passed. Well, we can reanimate him.
Yeah. Like he was just here trying to kill you, but you're like, well, we can have him back on the beat. No problem. And I do like the fact that, because obviously he's tried to cover it up, and then when he does, his first reaction is that, and his hands go up and stuff, and so you know that Herbert West has crossed the line. But again, none of that sort of like that doesn't seem to bother Dan in the slightest at this point. He's sort of like, well, I'm all in, I might as well carry on, sort of thing. But yeah, no, I think you're right. I think the key thing is, like, there's good moments in this second one. Again, I think there's some great moments of comedy. I think, like you said, the dog with the big meaty forearm and some of them bits like that are quite well done. But the story is definitely thinner. I kind of like the idea that they have this wall that backs onto a tomb in the graveyard in this mortician's house, or in this grave house. And so they can actually sort of like, whenever he sort of like gets rid of one of his sort of like experiment play things. He just knocks down part of the wall, takes the bricks of the wall, pops it in this tube, and then bricks it back up again. And so when it all goes, because obviously Dr. Hill attacks at the end with a flying head and the all these other sort of these other zombies. One of them, I think, is one of them supposed to be the battered wife of Detective.
Yes, so she was in the asylum, wasn't she, a little bit earlier? So, and I think that was what put the detective onto what they were doing.
So yeah, she's been chased for that and then, like you say, the wall comes down and all these reanimated, body parts start to come through and attack Herbert West.
I feel like the animation on that was not great, like the execution, if you like, but the idea of it was fantastic. I thought it was great, and you just see all these kind of cast-off creations just coming through the hole in the wall. You're like, oh crap.
yeah, because there's some really weird ones. I think, and they've done some. So you say some look better than others. And I, without sounding morbid or grotesque, like I think they obviously used. I've never researched it, and I don't know, but I'm sure they used like real amputees at one point. For some one of them looks like it's it's got limbs missing. They've replaced them with something else, and but there's one as well, some great makeup where one of them, I think it's Dan is fighting one, and it stood up and he pushes it away and it turns around and it's basically like two heads sort of like stuck together.
See, I want to be a fly on the wall in a planning meeting like that, and they're just sketching out on the whiteboard or on the wall or something, and just we could have this arm and a leg and stuff like that, because just the minds of these people to come up with all of these different creations, I think is impressive.
It is. There's some great creations in this, and I think that unfortunately they were limited by budget. I think that's the key thing. They are limited slightly by budget, and if they had, say, I don't know, just that extra bit of cash, I think some of this would look way better. But as a sort of if this was a straight to video, I sort of understand why. But yeah, we end with again Herbert West being sort of like overtaken by these many these creations, as you put it, due to tearing apart, and Dan escapes with Francesca into the night. Really sort of like that, and that's sort of it as sort of like credits roll.
And I think the way the bride, when she's pulled out the heart and everything and she's holding it, but then the whole body starts to disintegrate almost. I thought that was really done quite well as well. But again, that's the practical effects, isn't it? Yeah, the practical effects, I think, are great. I think, there's some of the severed head when it's sort of like, even one point they have them carrying it and you can see the jaw moving and stuff. So they've done some fantastic work. But that's sort of like what Brian Usner, I think he was a special effects guy before he was, all this other stuff. So it's his bread and butter. But I love the fact that they have done it and lent into and done these effects and stuff. So I think it looks really cool. So I enjoy this second one. I think there's some really standout moments, but like you say, overall, it's definitely lesser than the first one. But before going, any final thoughts then for Bride of Reanimator? Yeah, and because I say it's lesser than the first one, I still think there's a lot of fun to be had watching this one. Like I say, for those moments, I think what I say about the writing, I'm really talking about those plot points, the story. One of the great lines, though, which again just speaks to Herbert West's character, is when he's talking about blasphemy. He's accused by Fabiana of blasphemy for creating all of these things. And he says, like, I've got the quote here, "I will not be shackled by the failures of your God. The only blasphemy is to wallow in insignificance." Brilliant, absolutely brilliant. Proper, villainous monologue. I just think it's brilliant. Utterly consistent with the character, and again, he is. talk about lack of continuity in the story, but his performance is consistent. You know, he remains in the second one that Batman villain.
Yeah.
But just, you know, he's realized with this, having this consciousness in the different parts of the body, that he can really go off the map.
Yeah. Yeah, I think again, like Jeffrey Combs, it's a Jeffrey Combs show. Like he is a fantastic performer, and I love what he brings to this. Really, I think, you know, just sort of we are going to be going on to Beyond Reanimator, which was much later. It was 2003, so it's 13 years later. And From Beyond, which actually is back in the 80s, both featured Jeffrey Combs. But I wanted to say, actually, one of my first, I think, like one of the, you know, you sort of like you connect. You don't really, you do or you don't connect actors, and there's certain moments you go, "Oh my god, that's so and so." Another performance by Jeffrey Combs I just want to call out for a film that I think it also doesn't get enough attention is The Frighteners, which I think is 95. Michael J. Fox.
Iconic poster as well, wasn't it?
Yes. Yeah. Gary Busey's son, Jake Busey, and obviously directed by Peter Jackson. And he plays like an FBI agent. He basically is a sort of a surrogate for Fox Mulder kind of thing in it,
right?
And he is again that performance that he gives in that film is absolutely phenomenal. So I do want to sort of call that out as a if everyone's sort of watching these, as a bit of a side note, go check out The Frighteners as well, because it's ace, and he is great in that. Anyway, I think we are wrapping up on these two before we move on. So before we wrap up, Dave, where can people find you and where can people hear you?
So, first of all, thanks a lot, Scott. It's been a lot of fun. I wouldn't have gone back and watched these, to be honest, if you hadn't have suggested, you know, you were doing this retrospective. So it's been brilliant fun to watch them and then come and sort of chew the fat with them about them as well. You can get me on either Comics in Motion, in a bunch of the shows there, mostly the TV and movie reviews. Closest one to what we're doing today is probably the VHS Strikes Back. That's a weekly show, and we'll talk about, you know, some kind of film from that VHS era, of which this one is in. But it'd take me a while to convince Chris, my co-host, to do any horror movies. So that's why I'm probably better covering that one on here.
yeah. Go check this out. There'll be links down below for what they call it, the whole Comics in Motion sort of network, the thread. Every day there's something new. It's all fantastic. But ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for listening. I really appreciate you listening. And if you like what we're doing and you're enjoying this retrospective or anything else that we do, go to your podcast catcher and give us a review. Any 4 stars, 5 stars preferably. But all your feedback helps, and we really appreciate it all. So, you know, I hope you can do that. But if you really like what we're doing and you want to sort of contribute and support the show, go check out our Patreon. It's www.patreon.com/20cgmedia. That's 20th Century Geek Media. And there's a link down below. And you will find all kinds of podcasts on there and extra bonus content of us chatting about all kinds of different bits and pieces. Anyway, for now, Dave, thank you very much for watching these films with me, and I look forward to doing part 2. And for ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much, and we shall talk again soon.